人民共和国中央人民政府今天成立了。
October 1st, 1949, the Chinese Communist Party chairman, Mao Zedong, announced the creation of the People's Republic of China, sending the Chinese nationalist government, a U.S. ally known as the Kuomintang, into exile in Taiwan. Almost from the start, the relationship between the new China and the United States was hostile. The Chinese initially wanted to establish friendly contacts with the United States, but the U.S. government rejected Zhou Enlai's public letter for diplomatic relations and decided that a possible future recognition of the People's Republic of China would require both congressional and presidential backing. Typically, in the past, acknowledging a country needed only presidential approval.
One said this phrase that I really liked, that you do your job because 你要为人民服务 and 我今天采访您也是要为人民服务。I read an interview that you had with the Chinese version of Al Men, and in the interview you mentioned your senior thesis in which you talked about how in 1944 and in 1945 Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai actually wanted to establish friendly relations with the United States, but they weren't allowed to actually meet President Roosevelt. Right. And I know a lot of historians, they think that if it were not for this rejection or this mistake, then the Chinese and the United States would have actually established diplomatic relations far earlier than 1979. Whereas I know other historians like Richard Bernstein in his book China 1945 believe that regardless of whatever happened, they would not have established diplomatic relations earlier due to ideological conflicts. I just really wanted to know where are you and where were you? What position did you take when you were writing your senior thesis?
Well, I think the majority view is probably Richard's view. I think he's probably the majority view. I'm a minority view. Now, the thesis was about reading Yan'an Bao and understanding that Mao and Zhou were directing them to put in place pro-American propaganda in Yan'an Bao. So for those 365 days, I studied it. Now, the fact that they were instructing their own people to put in place pro-American propaganda was because they expected post the end of World War II to have a closer relationship with the United States, but it just wasn't to be for 35 years. But I believe that we should have taken advantage of that, and it kind of laid the seeds of my belief that we need to understand China better so that we can make for a closer relationship where we can take advantage of openings. I think that failure may have led to the Korean War ultimately and led to the estrangement of the United States and China from 1949 to 1972.
中国人被日本人炸得那么苦，那个时候蒋介石的空军已经打得一架飞机都没有了，打光了。
Later in the war, the Chinese received aid from the United States. The first American volunteer group of the Chinese Air Force, commonly known as the Flying Tigers, helped destroy the Japanese Air Force and became extremely popular among the Chinese. The Chinese were extremely grateful, although this genuine gratitude diminished when the United States supported Jiang Jieshi, the leader of the Kuomintang and a despised figure in mainland China. After the establishment of the People's Republic of China, the U.S. focused on a policy to isolate and contain China and referred to the communist-occupied mainland as Communist China, or Red China. Although the U.S. government did not completely trust the leaders of the Kuomintang, American relations with Taiwan stabilized throughout the 1950s, partly due to the creation of a mutual security treaty, while American relations with mainland China stayed frozen. The United States would refuse to officially recognize a communist government until 1979.
The major issue, and we had a lot of issues between us that had to be resolved. The principal one was Taiwan. There are very many people in the United States, in the U.S. government at the time, that strongly supported Chiang Kai-shek and his government, and to totally, it would have been impossible to make that switch and turn on a dime. It took years of discussions and negotiations until solutions could be found to resolve that issue.
And the Korean War only widened the gap between the People's Republic of China and the United States. So while the Chinese communists sided with North Korea, Americans backed South Korea. From 1950 to 1953, approximately 150,000 Chinese and 50,000 American soldiers died in the conflict.
等到一解放，头一件事就是抗美援朝。
At the time, the Chinese version of the Korean War was that South Korea, with the help of the United States, had attacked North Korea. According to Feng, the Korean War actually started to change Chinese sentiment towards Americans, partly because during the war, the Chinese believed that the American attacks were aimed towards New China.
17岁的我跟随部队如草参战，我所在的124师打响了抗美援朝的第一枪。黄草岭战斗，在长谷的战争中，我身边很多的战友牺牲了，很多战友负伤了。我对美军充满了仇恨，立志要彻底消灭美帝国主义。
In the decades after the establishment of Mao's government, Chinese and Americans publicly attacked one another. And as the American vice president in 1953, Nixon, who was a strong anti-communist, blamed the Chinese for American failures, claiming, "We can see that China is the basic cause for all our troubles in Asia." In the midst of the Cold War, Americans shunned the People's Republic of China because they feared communism, partly due to the Second Red Scare of the 1950s, and McCarthyism, which was a movement led by Senator Joseph McCarthy to eradicate and punish American communists. The Chinese actually saw America as their major enemy. What was the American public sentiment towards China back then?
Well, neither side was the other's best friend. We had been cut off for many years, a series of unfortunate incidents and things that happened very early on. Things could have gone in a different direction, but they didn't. The Korean War sort of complicated those factors as well. Before the Korean War, we were sort of on our way towards establishing a relationship with the PRC, but that was not to happen. And so from the late 1940s, certainly in the 50s, there was this anti-communist air in the United States and sentiments and feelings in the United States that made the population both anti-Soviet Union, anti-People's Republic of China, anti-Cuba, anything that rang of communism.
Yet, years later, in 1965, Nixon told his control officer Roger Sullivan that the United States should aim for a normal relationship with the People's Republic of China. And in 1967, in a foreign affairs article that he had written, Nixon claimed, "We simply cannot afford to leave China forever outside the family of nations there to nurture its fantasies, cherish its hates, and threaten its neighbors. There is no place on this small planet for 1 billion of its potentially most able people to live in angry isolation." The events in the late 1960s seemed to help Nixon's plan for normalization. Mao Zedong had taken note of Nixon's foreign affairs article and had even ordered the government-regulated paper, the People's Daily, to publish a transcript of Nixon's inaugural address in Chinese. This was the first time the newspaper had published a translation of an American president's inaugural address. Meanwhile, in the late 1960s, China was struggling with its economy. Feng attributed the economic conditions to the string of political movements from the 1950s.
从50年代初期开始，政治运动一个接一个，正反、三反、五反，反右倾。
Coupled with the Great Leap Forward, the political movement made the country's economy a disaster. There were international conflicts as well, so by 1969, the Chinese alliance with the Soviet Union had broken, culminating in the Sino-Soviet border clash in March of that year, and making the Soviet Union a threat to Chinese security. The United States appeared friendlier and less dangerous to China than the Soviet Union. In reality, the US actually opposed the Soviet Union's aggressiveness towards China to increase its own international standing and prevent the Soviet Union from becoming too powerful. Regardless, the Chinese were willing to increase relations with the US in order to counteract the Soviet threat.
Would you mind talking about the respective situations in the United States and in China around that time before Nixon visited China in 1972?
China was in the midst of the Cultural Revolution. The United States was in the midst of the war in Vietnam. There were enormous protests. Just a few blocks from here, I used to spend my weekends in Central Park protesting against the war in Vietnam.
中国、美国在建交之前，各自在国内和国际上的形势是怎样的？
中美建交，这个你要知道，了解这个中美建交之前，它基本上是处在一个冷战的这个格局下面。那么当然，这个中国那个时候呢，处于文化大革命当中，那么我们对外呢也是要说要去推行这个世界革命。那么和美国的关系是处在一个敌对的关系，对吧？我们还要这个打倒美帝国主义。那么美国同样呢，他也采取一个遏制中国的一个政策，因为他认为这个中国的这个发展对这个意识形态的这种扩张啊，对美国也构成一个威胁。
是什么因素导致中美两国放弃敌视的状态，开始走向和谐建交？
但我是反过来问，我是说为什么中美在整个60年代没有建交？为什么它这个建交一直到70年代初期，对吧？尼克松去了这个基辛格，尼克松去了中国之后，才实现一个所谓叫这个缓和嘛。那么后来79年的时候，卡特访78年访华之后，79年才正式建交。所以中间为什么一直拖了10几年没有？
Scholars have many explanations. One explanation says that there were ideological conflicts between communism and capitalism. As a result, the two countries couldn't possibly have friendly relations. Wang noted that there are actually problems with this explanation because after the two countries established diplomatic relations, neither abandoned their respective ideologies. Another misleading explanation attributes the delay to what is known as the balance of power. Since the Sino-Soviet split took place in the early 1960s, according to this explanation, China and the United States should have established relations in the early 1960s during the Sino-Soviet split and not in 1979.
我最后得出来一个结论是什么？是中美之所以在整个60年代没有办法实现一个缓和，是因为他们当时对各自的所处的这个国际体系当中所处的位置存在一个根本的一个分歧，也就是说，这个在中国看来，中国不承认美国在当时国际体系当中的一个主导的地位。
对。
那么从美国反过来看呢，美国也不承认中国所具有的大国地位，所以是有这么一个大的一个背景。
Nixon had several goals in mind. By attempting to establish relations with China, he hoped to stabilize Asia, restrain the Soviet Union, and peacefully end the Vietnam War, preferably with the help of the Chinese. Privately, he also wanted to eradicate democratic opposition and create a relationship with the Chinese before the Democrats did. Sino-American normalization would also benefit Americans by opening up the large Chinese market. However, in 1967, 90% of the American public had negative opinions on China, especially due to the Cultural Revolution. Americans saw communists as barbaric, unchristian, and dangerous. In fact, up until the Nixon administration, the US believed that the Chinese were even more threatening to American freedom than the Soviets were. The Kennedy and Johnson administrations had actually once debated on whether or not to team up with the USSR against China. How do you think the Vietnam War influenced both Chinese and Americans in terms of public's perception and government actions?
I think it certainly had an effect in terms of Sino-American relations because Vietnam was seen to be a client state of China or in some way heavily influenced by China. There were beliefs on the part of a great many people that China was very influential in the anti-Americanism that was so pervasive in Vietnam.
Even so, throughout 1969 and 1970, Nixon made subtle moves toward altering U.S. policy on China. His administration publicly declared that the United States would be against the Soviet invasion of China, and he even attempted to re-establish the Warsaw talks when he ordered the American ambassador to Poland to talk with his Chinese counterpart.
当年为什么美国人主动在华沙联系中国人呢？
在华沙这个会谈啊，这个时间要追溯到这个很早，这个最早的时候是第一次的这个台海危机，就54、55年的时候啊，有一次这个台海危机。那么当时的这个台海爆发这个危机之后呢，美国的这个领导人啊，特别是他的国务卿叫杜勒斯，那他就认为是说，这个一方面他觉得我外交上我不能承认你这个中华人民共和国，我不承认。可是呢，同时他又觉得我有一个需要跟你中国去谈，因为他觉得这个关系非常紧张，他怕这个情势失控。
The Warsaw talks became a method for the U.S. to interact with the People's Republic of China and ensure that the U.S.-China relationship would be relatively stable. However, the talks did not stimulate significant progress. Adding to other American attempts to contact the Chinese, Nixon also informed the presidents of France, Romania, and Pakistan of his interest in opening talks with China, though the Chinese did not immediately respond. Finally, on December 9, 1970, over a month after Nixon told Chinese leaders through the president of Pakistan that he wanted to send an emissary to China, the White House received a response. An American emissary would be welcome in Beijing. In fact, at the same time, the Chinese were looking to normalize relations with the United States so that they could deter a Soviet invasion. They also hoped to solve the Taiwan issue and avoid entering the Vietnam War against the United States.
Why do you think both the Americans and the Chinese were willing to put aside their Cold War hostile tactics in favor of more open diplomatic relations?
Common enemy, the Soviet Union. So what united us was the Soviet Union. So the necessity to cooperate, Mao had realized he needed the United States to oppose the Soviet Union, and Nixon realized that China's cooperation with the United States could further our interests against the Soviet Union. So that's what drove it.
中美啊，在这个战略的这个认识的这个分歧上面，后来是产生了很大的这个问题啊，产生了很大的分歧。
The Chinese and American motives were different. Mao was willing to team up with the United States against the Soviet Union because he believed that the USSR was the greatest threat not only to China, but also to the world. He wanted China and other countries near the Soviet border, including those in the Middle East, to join forces against the Soviet Union. Nixon, on the other hand, wanted to ease tensions in the U.S. relationship with the Soviet Union, a doctrine known as détente, and he believed that establishing friendly relations with China would help that process. Mao and Zhou also wanted to connect with the Nixon administration so that China could modernize and play a role in the global economy.
这段时间呢，经济上困难到了极点，什么东西都要票。中国的左派、右派有一个争论，左派就说文化大革命好得很，那么右派就问他，你说好得很，你愿不愿意回去啊？
And neither of our two governments encouraged their populations to learn more or be more understanding about the other country until 1971-72, which was the era of ping-pong diplomacy.
In 1971, Nixon eliminated the constraints that prohibited Americans from visiting mainland China. And that same year, people from the two countries interacted with each other for the first time at a ping-pong tournament in Japan, at which the Chinese invited the American ping-pong team to compete in China. Mao himself actually approved of this development by overruling documents that banned Americans from going to China.
There was a big headline in the Hong Kong paper that the Chinese ping-pong team had invited an American team Both teams were playing in Japan at the time in a tournament, and the Chinese invited the Americans, instead of going directly back to the United States, they invited them to stop off in China first.
And Zhou was very excited about this development because ping-pong diplomacy was an excuse to interact with the United States. Ping-pong diplomacy also helped lead to Nixon's China trip. Kissinger told Nixon that given how kindly the Chinese had treated the ping-pong team, Nixon would definitely be welcome in China as well.
您认为乒乓外交起了多大的作用？
乒乓外交当然在中美关系这个建交，在中美这个尼克松的这个访华当中，它是一个很重要的一个推动的一个力量。
What was your reaction to ping-pong diplomacy in 1971 and 1972?
We were all stunned and thrilled. I mean, it was just wow. Suddenly, we were studying Chinese and we could not go to China and we had no contact with China. And suddenly President Nixon, suddenly Secretary Kissinger, National Security Advisor Kissinger was there. He wasn't secretary yet. And then suddenly President Nixon was there. It was awe-inspiring.
China had actually attempted to reach out to the United States before ping-pong diplomacy. In response to Nixon's statement in the fall of 1970 to a Time magazine reporter that, "If there is anything I want to do before I die, it is to go to China," Mao himself invited American journalist Edgar Snow to the Tiananmen Tower as a statement. And in December 1970, he also told Snow that he would be glad to receive Nixon in China. The People's Daily published on December 25th that Zhou had informed Snow back in November that if the United States government were serious about changing Sino-American relations, China would be willing to accept an American diplomat. The paper even noted, "Every citizen in the world, including the American, is our friend." However, these hints were not picked up by the US. But ping-pong diplomacy seemed to work. On June 2nd, 1971, Mao sent Nixon a personal invitation to visit China. And in July 1971, Kissinger took a detour from his trip in Pakistan and secretly visited China to make preparations for Nixon's own trip. Meanwhile, an American security detail acted as Kissinger's double and pretended to be sick from a stomachache. No one knew about Kissinger's visit apart from a select few in the White House. And given the ongoing battle between Kissinger and the State Department over who would be in charge of managing foreign policy, Secretary of State William Rogers did not know about the negotiations with China or about the secret trip until Kissinger was already in Asia. Chinese officials were extremely suspicious of Kissinger, partly believing that the Nixon administration wanted to keep Kissinger's trip confidential because they were ashamed of visiting China or because they wanted to back away from possible negotiations. At the meeting, Zhou and Kissinger discussed the most sensitive topic, Taiwan. The US had promised earlier that it would withdraw some of its troops from Taiwan and help resolve the conflict between the communist and nationalist governments. Kissinger made more promises to Zhou at the meeting, though he later downplayed the significance of the topic in his memoirs by noting, "Taiwan was mentioned only briefly during the first session." Zhou made some concessions on Taiwan, but Kissinger also assured him that the United States would be willing to remove 2/3 of its troops from Taiwan during the post-Vietnam War era. But some other aspects remained unsolved. So at the meeting, the United States did not get a promise from China that it would help resolve the Vietnam War. However, the negotiations assured both countries that neither would attack or help attack the other. Kissinger even promised Zhou that the United States would inform China of any Soviet military movements and Soviet-American plans that affected the Chinese. Later, on July 15th, the two countries announced their plans.
The announcement I shall now read is being issued simultaneously in Peking and in the United States. Knowing of President Nixon's expressed desire to visit the People's Republic of China, Premier Zhou Enlai, on behalf of the government of the People's Republic of China, has extended an invitation to President Nixon to visit China at an appropriate date before May 1972. President Nixon has accepted the invitation with pleasure. The meeting between the leaders of China and the United States is to seek the normalization of relations between the two countries, and also to exchange views on questions of concern to the two sides.
The announcement shocked and angered Taiwan, as well as other American allies, including Japan, whose government had been informed of the news only a few minutes before Nixon's speech. The news also surprised the Soviets, who subsequently attempted to negotiate with the Nixon administration. The trip was also a shock for Chinese citizens. Anti-American sentiment was as strong as ever among the Chinese public. The Cultural Revolution had swept over mainland China. Citizens all wore dark-colored clothing, but enthusiastically waved red flags while chanting, "In the world right now, who is scared of whom? The people aren't scared of American imperialists, but American imperialists are scared of the people." For the Chinese, America represented an evil, capitalist country whose goal was to destroy China and communism.
1972年，美国总统尼克松访华，听到这样的消息，我觉得很惊讶。难道不要再打倒美帝国主义？我的脑子一时还难以接受，因为我的心里还是充满了为战友复仇的想法。
And Nixon faced opposition from conservatives who critiqued the talks with China. Years earlier, the Johnson and Kennedy administrations had abandoned their thoughts on changing Sino-American relations, partly because they had been worried about the very conservatives who were attacking Nixon. But there was one group of Americans who were excited about the event: the press. The reporters, like other Americans, were extremely unfamiliar with China.
Up until then, the idea was Mao Zedong ate babies for breakfast, so to speak. There had been this exaggerated caricature of the way the Chinese were, that they had that the communist system had essentially dehumanized.
Wow, I'm finally aboard the plane. We're going to China. China, closed for all these years. It was a little bit the feeling we're leaving Earth and going deep into the cosmos of some distant planet.
Nixon and Kissinger left for China on February 17, 1972, and on February 21st, Nixon arrived in China accompanied by his wife, Pat Nixon, and other officials, including Kissinger and Bill Rogers. Making sure that he would not repeat John Foster Dulles' dismissal of the communists as a passing phase, and his blatant refusal to shake Joe's hand at a Geneva conference in 1954, Nixon walked down the steps of a plane with his arm outstretched to greet Joe. The arrival was carefully planned out and broadcasted by the media. In fact, Pat Nixon's coat color was intentionally red so that she would stand out in the crowd of dark-colored clothing. The Americans saw the Chinese welcoming as extremely lukewarm. The Chinese honor guard greeted Nixon, but there were also Chinese banners that indirectly criticized the United States. After Kissinger and Nixon arrived in Beijing, Joe suddenly invited them to meet Mao. Although no specifics were discussed, the meeting signaled that the Chinese were willing to create a new relationship with the United States. Kissinger and Nixon tried to keep the State Department out of the negotiations. All three American interpreters on the trip were part of the State Department, so Nixon depended on Chinese interpreters instead, for fear that the American interpreters would reveal the contents of the negotiation. Secretary of State Bill Rogers was also kept out of the only conference with Mao Zedong. Kissinger's young assistant, Winston Lord, took his place instead, but was cropped out of the photograph of the meeting so that Rogers would not feel humiliated.
中美两国人民愿望的积极行动，这在中美两国关系史上是一个创举。
Nixon then met with Joe and other Chinese officials 9 times that week. Meanwhile, Pat Nixon interacted with Chinese citizens by visiting the Peking Hotel Kitchen, the Evergreen People's Commune, the Peking Glassware Factory, and Chinese cultural landmarks, including the Summer Palace. The president and his wife also experienced Chinese culture when they watched a Chinese ballet with Beijing officials. The woman to the right of Nixon in the photograph was Mao Zedong's wife, Jiang Qing, who helped lead the Chinese political faction known as the Gang of Four. After Mao passed away in 1976, the Gang of Four was charged for being counter-revolutionary. Nixon's plan to climb the Great Wall of China was almost cancelled after a snowstorm. Mao Zedong had once famously said that until a man has climbed the Great Wall of China, he is not a real man. To solve the problem, Beijing citizens used brooms and other household items to sweep away 50 miles of snow on the streets so that Nixon could climb the Great Wall. Later that week, Nixon visited the cities of Hangzhou and Shanghai. Near the end of Nixon's trip on February 27, 1972, both sides produced a Shanghai communiqué to summarize the conclusions of the meetings that week. The joint communiqué acknowledged the ideological and political differences between the United States and China, but stated that both countries were aiming for peace and the normalization of Sino-American relations. Previously, since 1950, the U.S. had noted that the Taiwan issue was undetermined.
那么《上海公报》里面很重要的一句话是叫这个美国 acknowledge，
对，
这个两岸的这个中国人啊，这个同属都是中国人，那么这个同属一个中国，所以它叫一个中国的这个政策 One China Policy。但是中国呢，我们叫一个中国的原则，这个还是有区别的。那么因为美国的它实际上不是承认啊，但这个词我们被翻译成承认，所以它其实是一定程度上是中英文的各自表述。在英文里面，这个叫 acknowledge， 那是在这个中文里面呢，我们就叫它是说这个翻译成承认。
However, Nixon privately informed Zhou that the U.S. government would eventually admit that Taiwan was a part of the People's Republic of China.
为什么说台湾问题是中美关系的核心问题呢？
实际上，他后来说了一句话非常有名，他这句话是叫这个台湾事小，世界事大。他说这个台湾可以放100人啊，不用管，因为那个时候的美国领导人是觉得是说这个我是不是一定要台湾问题解决，我们中美才能这个建交啊？但一方面来讲，这个当时尼克松这个访华来中国的时候，台湾确实是一个非常重要的一点。
The trip did not resolve the Vietnam War as Nixon had hoped it would. However, it did restrain the Soviet Union, and it marked the start of an alliance between the United States and China. Nixon's trip opened up the way for more interaction between the two countries. In April 1972, ping-pong diplomacy was once again put into play when the Chinese ping-pong team visited the United States and became the first delegation from the People's Republic of China to do so.
When the ping-pong team first came to the United States, they were here for almost a month, and we traveled to many cities, and the journalists used to ask them all the time, what surprised you most about your time here in the United States? And their reaction was to say, the warmth and the friendship of the American people. And the first several times I heard it, I thought, well, that's what they were told to say. They're being very diplomatic. But as I was traveling around this country with them, I found that if I had been asked that question, I would have said the same thing, because despite the fact that Americans had generally been taught not necessarily to fear China, but it was a very different place, and you had the whole communism overlay of it, and the image of Chinese ants all marching in a row, and to my, not just surprise, but to my delight, most of the Americans that we met and that came out to see the ping-pong team or the acrobats or whatever were very receptive. They were very eager to get to know the Chinese. They were eager to find out what they thought and what they were like. And so I myself was very impressed with the warmth that was shown to the Chinese when they were here.
Although there were a few anti-communist demonstrations during the visit, Americans for the most part enthusiastically welcomed the Chinese, who seemed equally excited to play exhibition matches and see the United States.
Pick a sport, and the National Committee sent the first swimming team, diving team, basketball, women's basketball, men's basketball, volleyball, swimming, etc. And some big performing arts. We sent the Philadelphia Orchestra to China and the Boston Symphony. We brought back major performing arts teams. I took the first group of university presidents to China, the first group of mayors to China, first group of governors to China.
When you visited in 1973, would you say that your previous perception was skewed or pretty accurate?
I found the people that we met with, for the most part, were very warm, very welcoming. That was true of the Chinese that I met when I went in 1973. It was also true of the delegations that I was working with when we hosted them here at the National Committee. And my mother used to joke when I would call her after each one of these exchanges, I would go on and on about how wonderful. So she'd answer the phone and she'd say, well, tell me about your new best friends, because it was, I'm sure people were selected to be very friendly and warm and instructed to be very friendly and warm, but I thought it was pretty genuine. When Americans would go to China, we were treated with great deference and respect and great warm hospitality by our hosts and the people we were meeting with. But even when we walked out on the street, we were treated more as objects of curiosity, because very few Chinese had ever seen Westerners.
Right.
And friends and I would joke that you sort of got a royalty complex. I mean, you'd be driving in a car and Chinese, whether it was in the city, first of all, cars were very unusual. There were no private cars at the time. There were a few buses, but it was mostly bicycles, donkey carts, mass transportation. The very few cars there were belonged to senior officials. And so whenever a car rode down the street, whether it was in a city and certainly in the countryside, it was an enormous curiosity. And so people would come running to the side of the road. They would drop their hose, they would drop whatever they were working with in the fields and come to the side of the road, and they would all, be staring and waving. And so I was sitting in this car and I sort of felt like the Queen of England, because I was waving back to everybody, and it sort of, we used to tease one another about being the King or Queen of England, waving to the subjects as we rode by.
When Kissinger visited China in 1973, he once again told the Chinese government that the U.S. would not support Taiwanese independence, and that the Nixon administration would ask Japan to not get involved in the Taiwan situation. Afterwards, to Kissinger's surprise, the Communists agreed to exchange allies and offices in Washington and Beijing. Kissinger had expected Zhou Enlai to agree to a trade office in Beijing, but to nothing in Washington, because previously, the Chinese had always refused to have an office in a country where Taiwan already had an office. Kissinger noted during the visit that the People's Republic of China and the United States had become tacit allies. In 1979, the United States, under President Jimmy Carter, and the People's Republic of China under Deng Xiaoping, officially established diplomatic relations through the joint communique on the establishment of diplomatic relations. This development took place 30 years after Mao established the People's Republic of China. Meanwhile, the U.S. terminated its formal relationship with Taiwan.
Nixon visited China in 1972, and then they established liaison and offices in their respective capitals in 1973, and then President Ford visited in 1975. Kissinger visited in 1973. He actually planned on establishing diplomatic relations by the end of 1976. So, given all this constant contact, why do you think it took all the way up to 1979?
U.S. domestic politics. Nixon had to resign, so he couldn't complete it. Ford was never elected. He was the unelected president. So it was left to Jimmy Carter, when I joined the State Department, to complete the establishment of diplomatic relations.
In China, although to a lesser extent, until Deng Xiaoping regained power in 1978, there was a lot of political turmoil with the arrest of the Gang of Four and the death of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai in 1976.
Nixon once said that his trip to China marked the week that changed the world. And certainly, we can only imagine how long it would have taken for the US and China to establish formal relations if Nixon had not visited China. Truly, Nixon's China trip changed the world.